Great days and glorious victory. My name is Spifflemonk, and by the elders! What is this? You humans are just as insane with your stories as you are with your human games. Anyway, I'm here to collaborate with my fellow content creator, Net Narrator. He's asked me to let you know that he can't show this very steamy scene on YouTube, but it's available for Patreon members at the Space Commando tier, or for YouTube members if you DM him on Discord, since YouTube doesn't allow that kind of content, but Net wants to make sure you guys can access it. Also, we've got a lot of new Death Worlders watching and subscribing to the channel recently. Awesome! Don't forget to like and leave a comment too. Net also has a Ko-fi and a Steam profile if you want to send anything his way to brighten his day. Links in the description. Anyway, that's it from me. I know you Death Worlders love to hear about my adventures on Net's channel. He's recommended me a game recently and says I'll love it. Has anyone heard of a game called Dark Souls?
Stop. If the words were a surprise to him, they seemed even more so to the woman who spoke them. But with the words said, the moment seemed to be broken. The spell of lust shattered. "We can't," Griffith said, her hands moving to pull the open sides of her shirt closed. "We can't." She seemed almost trying to convince herself. William couldn't help the disappointment. Old in soul or not, he was still human. If he wasn't, this state of affairs wouldn't have to pass. "Are you sure?" he asked tentatively. He wouldn't push. That would be his only prompt. Desire or not, he had pride enough to limit himself to that much. "Gods, no." Griffith's laugh was practically filled with self-recrimination, her eyes roaming across him once more. "But that doesn't mean I'm not right." Deliberately looking to the side, she continued, "Put your clothes back on, William." Sighing internally, William couldn't help but smile even as he reached for his pants. "You know, being all dutiful is only making you more attractive, not less." "Don't." Griffith laughed humorously again. "My self-control is holding on by a thread here. Honestly, a cadet jumping me in my own office is practically out of some belt-ripper novel." Someone else might have taken that for an invitation, but William liked to think he was better than that. Oh, he wouldn't give up. He wasn't that much better, because he hadn't been lying. The woman across from him seemed even hotter than ever before. But his next attempt to bed the delicious dark elf wouldn't be here. Not now. She deserved that much. "Well, I applaud your self-control," he said, as he buttoned his shirt back up, the love bite on his neck now covered, even as some part of me laments it. "You and me both," Griffith said, as she finished making herself presentable again, moments before she sank into her chair. Daring to glance up, it wasn't hard to see both the disappointment, regret, and relief in her eyes, as she saw that he was once more decent. At least, mostly. His man downstairs seemed quite unwilling to admit that the moment had passed, and was now uncomfortably pressed against his pants. Something that wasn't helped by Griffith subconsciously wetting her lips when she noticed, prior to hastily glancing away. God, the things I would do to her, he thought. Ignorant of his thoughts, she took a breath, her tone becoming serious. "I think it best for both of us that we pretend this little incident didn't happen." Recognizing that the woman had slipped back into her role as instructor, William made the executive decision of moving back around her desk to right his own chair before sitting down and nodding. "Okay, ma'am." The easy response seemed to surprise the dark elf. Truly. She clearly hadn't expected him to take his rejection well. Likely she'd been getting ready for a very uncomfortable conversation. He shrugged. "As I recall, I initiated this. It'd hardly be fair of me to get into a tiff because you rightfully turned me down." The instructor actually stared at him for a few seconds after that. "That's a surprisingly mature approach, cadet." She coughed. "One that is appreciated. Especially as I should have shut the whole thing down the moment it started." William resisted the urge to smirk. Yes, She should have. But to be fair to her, how many single men would have turned down a no-obligation fuck session with an attractive younger female student back in his own world? Especially if said female initiated by literally throwing themselves at said teacher. Some, certainly. Not all, though. Not even most, probably, he thought. Sure, he did it daily with his own teammates, or mostly just Bonlin, but there were a number of exceptional factors at play there. Not the least of which being that in this world he as a man had all the opportunities he wanted to get laid if he so desired. He liked to think the icky factor of his age would mean his decision to stay away from anything romantic with said girls would remain the case if he had less opportunities for release. But as this most recent liaison proved, he was anything but made of iron, where women were concerned. That the woman across from him had accomplished the same feat in those circumstances was worthy of respect, even if it took her a minute or two to reach that decision. "We're all only mortal, ma'am," he shrugged, and as I said, I definitely initiated it. Something close to irritation flashed across the woman's features now at his blasé attitude. "Yes, you won't be punished for this particular incident, as I am also partially to blame. To that end, once you leave this room, we shall forget all about this. I will be the instructor once more, and you the cadet." She eyed him, "Because you can be rest assured that if the choice comes down to resigning my position, or allowing a cadet to buck discipline because of a shared incident, I shall not hesitate to take the former path." At her words, William allowed all levity to leave his face, as he looked at her with the utmost seriousness. "It won't come to that, ma'am. I can separate work from play. As you said, beyond those doors you shall be the instructor and I the cadet." Griffith nodded, though she paused a little at his word choice before shaking her head. "Very well, you may leave now, cadet. If you hurry, you should make it back to your room before the lights out bell." Standing up at her dismissal, William was thankful for the fact that his little man had finally admitted defeat, as the lack of a fishing pole in his pants made things significantly more comfortable as he made for the door. Though he did pause at the threshold. "Ma'am?" The dark elf glanced up from the paperwork she'd just been about to pull out, though there was no missing the stiffness of her movements, nor the fact that she flushed slightly as she looked at him. "Yes, cadet?" Her words were cautious, which only made William smirk internally as he kept his features entirely professional. "With that said, if we are to be no more than instructor and cadet beyond the walls of your office, does that mean we might be more within it?" Allowing himself one final smirk at the dark elf's gobsmacked and slightly flushed, and not with anger if he didn't miss his mark, he stepped out of her office and into the hall. That was a bad idea, he thought, as he made his way through the halls. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Oh, he'd certainly failed in his first attempt to bed his delightful instructor, but the semester was far from over. Marcy sighed a little as she walked through the darkened halls of the academy. Her arms and back were sore from the last 8 hours of hard labor, but that was nothing new. No. What was really bothering her was the damn persistent ringing in her ears. "Probably need to see the Magidocs again," she thought, a frown slipping across her features. Not ideal. Not ideal at all. She'd been hoping to make a trip into the city to visit Mr. Shalea's, to spend a little coin and scratch a few itches. A trip that definitely wouldn't happen if she spent all her coin on getting her ears fixed. The dwarf weighed the two options in her mind consideringly. On the one hand, she might be able to get a decent bit of sleep and actually hear what people were saying when they were talking to her. On the other hand, Dick. And not just any old Dick. Wood Elf Dick, given that Shalea's had gotten a new boy in. Certainly as a woman of culture, Marcy liked to think she was pretty omnivorous where men were concerned. Human, dwarf, elf, even orc. She sampled them all at some point. But she'd admit that she had a certain soft spot for the animal-esque wood elves. Perhaps it was because they were a bit rarer than the others, or perhaps she simply liked the way a set of cat ears looked on the lad. Either way, the temptation to forgo a bout of actual healing in favour of something more intimate only grew as she reached the door to her room. Well, it wasn't technically her room. She rented it from the academy. Admittedly, that wasn't cheap, but she considered it worth it not to have to walk too far at the end of her shift. Blacksmithing was hard enough as it was without having to trek all the way back into the city each night. And it wasn't like housing in the capital was that much cheaper. Though perhaps cheap enough that I wouldn't be having to choose between dick or being able to hear if I bit the bolt and actually got some property, she thought, as she fiddled for a room key. Tough day. The dwarf damn near jumped out of her skin, though she bit her tongue as she rolled around to find herself staring into the grinning features of a cadet. Nothing good came from making an enemy of a cadet. Sure, they were at the bottom of the academic totem pole now, below even magesmiths like her, but that didn't change the fact that they came from powerful families, and real nobles had long memories where slights were concerned. Plus, he was cute. Real cute. Not a wood elf, certainly, but as noted, Marcy considered herself a woman of culture. She didn't much care what race a boy was running, so long as he ran into her. And that's a royal uniform, she thought quickly. So he's only probably a proper noble, she thought. You're trying to scare the lights out of me, cadet? Marcy asked, affecting an irritated expression before the boy realized she'd been staring. He blinked. Ah, sorry, I thought you'd have heard me coming. Aye, she might have if her ears weren't ringing. Not that he needed to know that. Never mind that. She shook her head. What do you want? Perhaps in different circumstances she might have been a bit more measured, but it had been a long day, and cute boy or not, it was a little strange to have a cadet confront her just outside her room. More to the point, she was still a member of staff. Sometimes the first years needed reminding of that fact, before they tried to treat you like one of their servants back home. Again, cute boy or not, she wasn't about to play the part of errand girl, because he couldn't be bothered fetching whatever it is he might want. Ah, I just wanted to speak to you for a moment. Normally I'd have waited for a proper time, but given that I just happened to pass you in the hallway... He trailed off, even as Marcy quirked an eyebrow. Just happened to come across her. House Royal's section of the academy was a ways away. How did he... She paused as she realized she was talking to the same cadet that had been working in the forges earlier, and she had to fight down the rather lascivious grin that threatened to spill across her features at the memory. Perhaps it was the fact that he was in a decidedly different outfit, or the fact that she hadn't spent much time looking at his face, that had caused her to take so long to realize. Either way, she found herself feeling slightly more receptive and willing to forgive the likely fib, if only out of consideration for the treat the lad across from her had provided her and the other girls earlier. Lads, cadet or otherwise, tended to avoid the forges if they could. Usually they sent a teammate in their stead if they needed some work done, or get it commissioned through the academy's notice boards. Which was probably for the best, given just how distracting a man in the forge could be. With that said, it was always a treat when one did show up. A man who could work metal was definitely on the same level as a wood elf in her eyes. Perhaps even better, she thought, as she took in his baby blue eyes. About? She prompted. The boy fidgeted in place for a few seconds. Well, it's a little bit of an odd request. You see, I'm working on something a little secretive, and I was kind of hoping to get some time in the forges when they were empty. You know, to keep it secret. Marcy frowned. Forges are never empty. Rather than deflate, though, the boy just smiled and the dwarf felt her insides flutter. I know, the work you and your fellows do is too important to be put on hold. The fluttering inside the blacksmith only grew as he leaned forward, as if to whisper, his hands pressing gently on her arm. With that said, surely an hour wouldn't do too much harm. An hour? That was a very short period of time for any kind of metalwork. Still, an hour could be done. She was the head smith for the evening shift, so she could definitely swing it. Admittedly, she'd have to come up with a reason for it, but some bullshit about some kind of chemical spill could work. The question remained, though. Supposing I could, what would I get out of it? She asked. Perhaps a spot of healing and a trip to Shillelagh's wasn't off the table entirely. Nobles tended to have deep... Well, the boy said, I'm sure we could come to some sort of arrangement. Marcy shivered as she felt the hand on her arm move up and down. With that said, maybe the hallway isn't the best place for this discussion. It is nearly lights out, after all. Her throat suddenly felt dry. Nonetheless, the words she wanted to say managed to spill from her lips. Perhaps you'd want to continue in my room, she asked. I've got tea and stuff. She half expected him to scowl, perhaps even slap her for her audacity, despite his flirtatious manner. Instead, though, her heart soared, as he simply smiled. Well, that sounds like a grand idea. I had a little tea earlier, but alas, I was interrupted before I could finish. The hand on her arm became slightly more insistent, sending tingles up her spine. I wouldn't mind another cup.
Where the hell have you been?
Olsenia asked her teammate, as he all but stumbled into their dorm.
You were gone all night.
The lout actually had the audacity to glare at her, as he straightened his crumpled uniform. Negotiating, he whispered, likely mindful of the fact that the morning bell hadn't gone off yet. With the exception of Marlene, who was in the shower, the rest of their team was still asleep. Why are you up so early?
I was waiting for you, the elf grunted. And what the hell do you mean, negotiating?
Oh, gods, she hoped that didn't mean... Yet the more she looked at him, the more she could only conclude that was the case.
Gods above, my need is a whore, she thought exasperatedly.
Admittedly, she thought as much when they first met, but the intervening weeks had done much to dissuade her of the notion. Brazen as he could be, the man seemed perfectly willing to ignore the midget's constant overtures. And they were constant. Yet now it seemed he'd merely been biding his time before revealing his true self. Though it was possible he'd actually been visiting his fiancée, which, while a little scandalous, would hardly have been beyond the pale. Though she considered that rather unlikely given his ultimate plans to both challenge her to a duel and break off their betrothal. More than likely the man has simply been indulging his baser instincts with some other cadet. All while she and the rest of the team had been wasting their time worrying about him. Why? He actually had the audacity to look incredulous as he asked such a stupid question.
Because she'd been worried about him. Cad or not, he was a member of their team, and for all they knew he'd been jumped in some academy hallway. It was all they could do not to inform the staff that he was missing at lights out, with only Bodlin's word that he'd been meeting their instructor staying their hand, given that said instructor's office was in the same dorm area as them. It'd be pretty unlikely for him to be waylaid between there and here. Not impossible, though, she thought. Indeed, the only reason that hadn't been her first thought on seeing him was the rather satisfied grin he'd been wearing when he stepped in. Hardly the look of a man that had just been traumatized. Because you're part of our team, she said, finally. Frustrating man. With that said, whatever his other faults were, he was at least quick to admit fault, as she saw his features soften. Ah, my bad. He tugged at his shirt, revealing a hickey she most definitely didn't want to see. I was too busy thinking about... well, I didn't think. She sniffed. I would think not. He actually chuckled a little at her small joke. I just got some bad news. Then I was organizing something and it dragged on a bit longer than expected, he said. Bad news, she thought. Bolin did say he was going for a meeting over Orb, which would be expensive enough to suggest said news was important. And he's been getting a lot of mail recently. Olsenia's tone softened a bit at that, even as she tactfully didn't ask what said news was. Is that what they call it now? He shrugged with a small smirk. Sort of. It really was a negotiation, though. Something for the team.
And me, admittedly, but it'll still be useful. Ah, so he was a whore in truth. The thought sounded scathing and abstract, but truthfully, Olzenia found herself more amused than disgusted. Perhaps because of the knowledge that whatever he'd done was for the team, because one could say a great many things about their leader, but he wasn't a liar. A little cagey, perhaps, and far too free with his body, but he never seemed to outright lie to them. Admittedly, anything he did for the team benefited him, given he wanted them to somehow beat a third-year team by the end of the semester, but that didn't mean she didn't appreciate it on some level. The elf crossed her legs. Any chance you inform us as to what this thing is, or will you keep it to your chest like so many other things? Again, she saw her point hit home. You know what? Yeah, I can. Of the responses she'd expected to receive, that wasn't one of them. Mostly she'd just been trying to underline to her leader just how little he seemed to actually trust them all. A thought that stung, as much as she wished it didn't. Because whether she wanted to or not, over the past 2 months she'd come to value the members of Team 7. It was nice to know that the group of people would have her back unconditionally. Even the dwarf. Some part of her still cringed at being forced to be nice to the girl, and being treated the same in turn, while they'd visited the girl's kin. Another thing she was holding against her leader and Marlene, given that the pair had abandoned her to that fate.
Oh, she said finally. When?
The young man seemed to think for a few seconds. It's organised for this weekend. The elf cocked a delicate eyebrow.
And is there any chance you'll tell us what it is prior?
The human grinned. I think I'd rather show you, but you can trust me when I say that it'll definitely be interesting. Olzenia liked to think she'd be the judge of that.